Donc, bonjour à tous. Je vois qu'il y a pas mal de personnes qui commencent.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see there are people joining us, and I'm very pleased to see that there are quite many of us. So we'll hold this fourth webinar on AFROSCREEN project. And we'll just give you a few reminders for the use of Zoom applications. So you have the possibility to listen to interpretation. So you can listen to the English channel or the French channel.
At the bottom of your screen, so you can listen to the presentation in English. Et après, si vous avez des questions.
Then if you have any questions at the end of the presentation, you can ask them by raising your hand through, the reaction buttons, or by writing them in the chat box. And I think that, well, there's quite many of us yet, so I think we can maybe kick off the meeting. So I will stop sharing my screen. And we'll give the floor to Dr. Jean-François Guégan, who is the head of research at INRAE, and who accepted, so it's the National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment, and so he accepted our invitation today. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to our partners here today. So following the invitation, I made the suggestion of the following title. I'm very sorry, I had a screen that actually hid the presentation, so I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you share the screen back again, because when I shared mine, it stopped the sharing of your screen. Well, my screen is shared. Well, I can't see your screen. I don't know if my colleagues can see it. No, we don't. I think he needs to stop sharing the screen and share it back again. Very sorry, you need to do it all over again.
Ça arrive.
It's coming. So I put it back on with the title. So I've suggested this title and to address the issue of One Health, and thinking, wondering, One Health, what else? It's a reference to some advertisement to a product. And in order to trigger a discussion on how to develop a transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So it's the first time that I actually use this wording. I don't know if you can see the title properly, but on this first slides, you have a few warnings about the One Health concept in particular. You will see that this is one of the latest concepts, and so are called One Health and others. So I will present some of them with a few warnings. And this theme is not the subject of a research, it's the meta subject, so to speak. It goes beyond a given subject. So we don't work on One Health. A team, a laboratory, many laboratories work in this One Health approach, but usually you don't have one individual on their own working on such a subject. So that's what I call a meta subject. And so it demands thorough thinking and also perspective and time for understanding. And you will understand why it matters to have this long-term approach for those who work on molecules, for example, a meta subject that can be a theme for the first years of research of a researcher or teacher researcher. And the meta subject is very complex, as you will understand during my presentation. I think we are witnessing an expert factory that are not, well, how can I put it? They are non-believer, they're like laymen, and I think this is the responsibility of the whole research sector. And sometimes they can be influenced by or biased by political, religious beliefs, and so that's a subject I address on climate change and health, how it has been impacted over these past 10, 15 years by religious beliefs especially. And so that's very interesting to analyze. A lot of researchers are gullible sometimes. And during the latest One Health Congress that was organized before the pandemic in Australia, took place in a Presbyterian church. So this can become pretty biased, pretty partial, and can be used by some personalities and some people who don't know anything about the subject. And the meta subject is subject to beliefs. So with a phrase like, we think that. So for example, when you read the international literature, scientific literature, you have very, very few evidence on some, on transmission for some parasites from some bacteria, and especially for bacteria that will proliferate for raw meat that is going bad, for example. But you have very few situations in which consumption itself will trigger infectious risks. The hunt practices, the contact with fluids from an animal that has been hurt by a bullet. I mean, that is perception knowledge, so we call it. So this subject of One Health is often based on perceptions. It's not actually supported by scientific evidence. That's what we see from analyzing the literature over the past 10 years. And it can be applied to other subjects such as biodiversity and health, which is my area of expertise for about 20, 30 years. So I address climate change and biodiversity and health. I'm not sure what your knowledge is of this program, so I decided to explain you what is a multi-pluri, inter, and transdisciplinary research to avoid any confusion. So first, we tend to confuse pluri and multidisciplinary research that you can see on the left of the screen. So most of you will seek multidisciplinarity, and you have usually one person who does that, that uses other disciplines than theirs. So that's what we call multidisciplinarity, and we call pluridisciplinarity when there are different people coming from different disciplines and subjects. And as you can see on the slide on the top left, they have very few connections actually. So that's what we call pluri or multidisciplinarity, which is different from interdisciplinarity, which is illustrated here in the middle of the slide with the arrows. So you have discipline A, B, and X. So they are they cross one another, and they share knowledge and try to debunk some dogmas in order to come up with new hypotheses, new research principles, or even maybe disrupt the whole discipline. And then on the right, you have transdisciplinarity. And I think that will be interesting for you in the framework of the AFROSCREEN project. It is targeted at public health policies and political decisions. So what should be done with regard to what the research has proved, and also targeting at local authorities for a given country. So this is transdisciplinarity because this is a translation to the stakeholders. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I just wanted to remind you that a large amount of the work that can be performed usually, and not mentioning One Health, where in most of the cases, people have a plurial multidisciplinarity without doing multidisciplinarity. You have very few teams that actually apply this multidisciplinarity, because it's much more complex to carry out, and that it disrupts all principles, and subjects struggle to see these developments happening. So you need to be aware of these differences, because, well, they are quite significant. So I'd just like to remind you of some of the concepts, and the eldest one being eco-health, and that actually appeared before the 1980s, when it appeared in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and in France in particular. And that we translated as eco-epidemiology, or ecological epidemiology. So this uses systemic and pluridisciplinary approaches to promote the health of people, animals, and ecosystems in the context of social and ecological interaction. So this is a very clear definition. I am not going to make it more complicated. You can complete it if you want, or I can give you access to some articles, such as some of mine actually, that address this definition. One Health is more recent. It's a movement created in the early 2000s that promote an integrated, which means that this is targeting at a given subject, and it is a systemic and unified approach to public, animal, and environmental health at different levels, and it aims at better dealing with emerging diseases with pandemic risk. Global Health appeared in the 2009-2010, and it's mostly the ministry, the ministries of foreign affairs in Europe that actually addressed One Health and the meta subject One Health to respect my own definition. And so I took part in the drafting of a report that you can find online in 2010-2011. So we might get back to this later. And we can actually wonder why ministries of foreign affairs were interested in this meta subject. So that would be an interesting discussion to have. You have another, so that was for One Health. And now you have global health, which is the health of a population in a global context. And the term has been defined after 2005 as the field of study, research, and practice that gives priority to improving health and health equity. And I'm talking about human health here. So health equity between genders, etc., for all people of the world. So the concept of global health is actually addresses the health of human beings and not of ecosystems and animals. And then you have the fourth concept, which is very recent, which is the planetary health which refers to the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. And so it takes into consideration climate change, soil erosion, agriculture, and the impact of agriculture on health, on human health. And then in 2015, the Rockefeller Foundation and with the Lancet Journal developed the concept as the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. And then finally, the UN have gathered different experts within the One Health high-level expert panel about a year ago to actually combine those different concepts, and for some of them they kind of mean the same thing, and they revolve around the concept of One Health. And One Health is an integrated, unified approach that will aim at stabilizing people's health, but also animals and ecosystems' health. And it acknowledges the fact that health of human, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the environment in general is closely linked and interdependent. So a simplified representation of the four concepts. So you have first, well, as I said, it can be surprising to some people, but this is the principle that we call eco-health. So if you want an exact definition that is delves deeper into that, you need to go to the IDRC from Canada, which has developed an eco-health approach. And then you have the One Health concept in the 2000s that came to France in 2009, 2010 with the document from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and from the EU. And then in 2005, you have the Global Health, and the latest being planetary health. So it might seem kind of funny to see that the succession of these concepts without actually taking into account the previous concepts that were formally developed. I think this is one of the plays of our modern civilization, to actually not looking at concepts that have already been developed. We try to create things that have already been created. So it was important to mention, and that's the same slide as the previous one, but in these four concepts, and there are others, but I will focus on these four concepts. So eco-health mainly comes from ecological parasitology. It comes from people who work on parasitology, on transmission from parasites and infectious transmission. And they have this ecological approach to understand and model the transmission. The One Health concept comes from veterinary infectiology, mainly, without mentioning a specific field. And then you have global health, which is medicine at large, and then planetary health that comes from public health epidemiology, which takes into account the global transformation that will have an impact on a population's health on Earth. So on the top left corner, you have the same pattern, and with the red arrows that show the link with previous disciplines, from some specific disciplines, with thinkers that bring together these concepts: eco-health, One Health, global health, planetary health, to build whole subjects. So as with the coexistence of these concepts coming from different disciplines, you can see how the subject of transdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity can be very hard to develop. So it's just to discuss the origin of these concepts. I'll look at the history of science and epidemiology. So that's what you can see on the lower part of the slide on the right corner. So that's a concept that was born in the 2000s, 2005, and they will be subject to a number of articles that contradicted them. For example, in this piece, that say that you say that you do interdisciplinarity, you do synthesis, but not at all. And that's what you can see from these three charts that show that the scientific output is works in silos, really. We have in France a writer, Albert Camus, a very famous French author, who used to say, when you don't have any more ideas, you still have words. And One Health has kind of become a word, but that doesn't actually trigger this inter and transdisciplinarity. So I am not against the ideology behind that underpins One Health. I'm the first one actually to do transdisciplinarity and to push for more transdisciplinarity. What I mean is that each mother discipline, so to speak, a root discipline, tends to limit the concept to what it knows. So ecological parasitology, veterinary infectiology, medicine, or public health epidemiology. So just what you can see, that's what you can see in this on the slide with the study that's been published in in PLOS Biology, that showed that it's not as transdisciplinary and disciplinary as it supposedly is. So your disciplines are still working in silos. And I will show you another very interesting and recent study that was published by Fasina, who is a young Nigerian researcher, and actually all of these authors actually come from Africa. And in 2021 already, they analyzed the 145 initiatives, One Health initiatives identified in sub-Saharan Africa. And they address a number of issues. So you can see that One Health networks are mostly in Eastern Africa, not that much in Central and West Africa. So that's what was observed in 2021. So 145 initiatives, and yet they say that when they analyze most of these projects, most of these programs, so 145 initiatives that have been launched, well, they are mostly academic. And they are mostly zoology, looking at vectors. That's important to do that, to carry out this work, right? But still. And they also try to identify what could host viruses potentially harmful to humanity. And they have very narrow perspectives. Many researches on animals, reservoir animals, and very limited research on infectious risk. And yet that's what we expect. So how many human cases are infected by the viral bacterial agent that is being studied? But yet there is very limited inclusion of active sectors, politics, for example, in order to make the right decisions, and also citizen participation for the for the program, like, so what we call actually the stakeholders, and so their commitment, well, their involvement in the programs. And it concludes that that's what One Health proposes actually, and what it already does. And so this work that is a work of analysis and synthesis shows that these programs have a very a reductionist view and balance in stakeholders representation. So there are different sectors that could be involved, but that often translate into narrow perspectives because they don't look at animals and environment that much, and they don't look at infectious risk and a number of cases in patients. So it's very surprising, really, because there is a number of initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa, and this analysis, and it's not my work, right? It's very respectable work done by African authors themselves. So when I prepared this presentation, I found a more recent article published in 2022 by the same authors, the same researchers in a journal. And they are working, they tried to delve deeper into this issue and see if there's been any progress. And that's what I looked at. I wanted to know if they do transdisciplinary. So they looked at whether they worked in a transdisciplinary fashion, if they have this systems thinking and the role. Well, we don't target like the infectious agent by isolating it from the rest. And we can see that, there's been some level of improvement, so it actually contradicts the previous paper, but and there is just 1 year apart from one study to the other. But they indicate that some aspects are not addressed in One Health programs, and in particular environmental aspects that are close to nearly not addressed. And there is a level of subjectivity also by the assessors and the drafters as well. And I think that, I think that this paper was quite thorough, and that the journal asks for them to give a new perspective with maybe a more thorough study on some particular countries. So there's been some improvement with this One Health leitmotif, and there were probably some success, but facing difficulties to have a true transdisciplinarity. And One Health comes from veterinary science mostly. I'd like to remind you. If we look at, like, you remember my presentation, so when I used this circle, which is actually not a circle, it's more of an inner tube. Eco-health is the eldest concept, and planetary health is the more recent one, but they're actually close to one another. They are quite similar. They have this hypothetical deductive approach. It has this heuristic that is based on more or less effective means based on statistics and mathematics. So we have eco-health and planetary health that is getting more similar to planetary health through the use of similar approaches. So cohort analysis, for example. One Health and Global Health are actually quite different from one another. There is very limited scientific formalism. We often talk about holism, even though I never use that term. Holism is a political theory that was just developed by people in South Africa, and Smuts in particular, in the time at the time of the apartheid. And people don't know that actually when they use the term holism. Holism is addresses ecology, but well, it hasn't been very successful in their ecological approaches because it was very descriptive. It didn't have any substance really. So it had to be developed, and holism basically has disappeared from ecological thinking. So it's kind of surprising to see this term coming up, whereas it can be actually something totally different. And well, usually they have this declaratory approach, and sometimes they don't give the method. It's more incantatory. So the One Health concept, which is a sound concept, require the involvement of other disciplines, and there's no methodology. And so for the past 50 years in France, we are told that we need inter and transdisciplinary, that we give it without giving us the necessary resources and a methodology to make sure that the disciplines can mutually benefit one another, with this idea of informing public health at national and international levels. And the problem with One Health is that it's focusing very much on infectious agents and the fact that they can be zoonosis coming from animals to human beings, whether they are domestic or wild animals. But there's no it's not like what philosophers say, such as Voltaire, about miasma, but we know that lots of these viruses come from animals and water, but before coming to the animals, they come from somewhere. And most of them, as I said in the slides, on the slide, it comes from fungi and come from water, and they can have a plant or telluric origin. And so that's a problem. That poses a problem for the future for agriculture, with root systems that contain the bacteria that I've just put on the slide. So some of them can be serious infectious agents, and that's something we've completely forgotten about. Here on this slide, so we can see the different banners, so you can see the different titles at the center. So you have here the hierarchical organization of living beings, so from molecules, genes, to the cells, and then from cells to organ and tissue, and then individuals, population, and human beings are part of that, and then to ecological community, and then environment, ecosystem at large. So, but sometimes, like for example, biomedical science go from molecules and genes to individual, and they don't go farther. Otherwise, it's more for epidemiology, and then the sector that I work in, that is like in surveillance of infectious diseases. We study these different levels of the living beings. Most of us work on genes and molecules, but try to connect them to phenomenon that have a larger impact or effect. And this has a consequence, as you will see on the next slide. So here you have our chronological evidence that we have for measles epidemics in the UK. So that's what you can see in black. So there is, and you can see that it's kind of, regular. And it's over 40, 50, 60 years. So you can see the steadiness. I didn't mention the vaccine, the data vaccine. So you can, that's when you have a decrease in the number of cases on the chart. And so that makes the transmission harder, of course. And on the medium to long-term research, you can see the steadiness. The measles epidemic usually happen before the vaccine period and are in not as clear a fashion after the vaccines, and every 2 years and a half. For the bacteria, that causes pertussis, it's about 4 to 4.5 years. And that's very important to inform public health policies, because it shows when we should intervene to give people their shots. And in terms of vaccine campaigns, there will be this phenomenon of redundancy in the transmission of the epidemic. So here it's a dynamic transmission for measles and pertussis. A long time ago, I worked on this kind of issues, and just to show you that some explanations can appear only after medium-term research. For measles, for example, that take place every 2 to 2.5 years. And obviously there will be determinants for that to happen, to have this cyclic effect. And you will never be able to show that if you look only at the Petri dish and you keep locked up in your laboratory. You need to analyze cases, to have chronological data over a long period of time in order to do this research. So at organizational level, you will have determinants that might not apply to other levels of living beings analysis, for example. So at each level, you have determinants of health that will structure, organize, shape the propagation or transmission drivers. So if you, well, it's very good, I mean, to work in a laboratory, but what I'm saying is it's not sufficient if you want to identify explanations or elements that intervene at another space and time level. So as I said, you might spend most of your time in the laboratory, and if something might require you to look at other aspects. And in the natural systems, you can have our transmission vectors, you can have an agent, an animal agent, you can have zoonoses that will trigger epidemics or pandemics, just like we had with SARS. So they have their own dynamic, and depending on an event, I mean, and that's probably what happened in the past few years on planet Earth, where the problems with pollution, deforestation as we know it today, and others such as globalization, circulation. So you have a level of organization that you can see on the bottom right, and that will lead to a tipping point in systems organization. And so any backward step is impossible. and that's what we call chaotic elements in physics. So it, yeah, the ecosystems and the infectious agents in these ecosystems that will experience an imbalance. That's what you have in red, and that will change the whole dynamic. So that's what is shown here in a very simplified way. Like disruptions in the environment, modifications, but also changes in demography in some parts of the world. We can also mention sociological issues over the past, well, I don't know, dozens of years, 50 years, that took place, well, over the past 50 years, that will cause some diseases to emerge that are ongoing but have not been revealed yet. And so environmental disruptions such as deforestation has already triggered the transmission of viruses coming out of the woods, and that colonized the human beings, like the human species. And we have some dates for Ebola virus, for example. We know that it took place 5 to 6 years, well, 5 to 6 years after significant deforestation. We can tell that, well, which kind of trees that were cut, and that could actually result in this, in Ebola virus being transmitted. And for the Borrelia ulcer, it's 10 to 20 years after deforestation to develop agriculture. And that's what is put here, as indicated here. The M-type HIV was transmitted to man by chimpanzee in the south of Cameroon, for example. No, probably between 1915 and 1941, and yet it had been silent up until then. So the deep changes that we can observe on Earth, there will probably emerging phenomena that are ongoing but not revealed yet, and it's due to the complexity of the system and this inertia in the response of these systems. Next slide. Doctor, you asked me to tell you when you had spoken for 40 minutes. So it's been 40 minutes. Okay, so I will not be able to make the full presentation, but I wanted to say that the consequence of that is that we can't tell future but what happened in the past. So there are some unpredictable consequences. As you know, there are at least 13 passages known for transmission from apes to human beings. Over 99% of infections are for HIV are due to M-type HIV-1. But what I wanted to say, this phenomenon of emergence and passage is what we can see, but how many emergence phenomenons, what I call attempts, have taken place? Well, we have no idea. And we have this emergence phenomenon, which is a dynamic phenomenon according to a probability law. So we have one success for a very large number of failures, of emergences that didn't take place, hence the importance of surveillance, even of asymptomatic cases, for cases that wouldn't be a pathology and that could become an emerging disease in the future. So there are many failures to a few success that create these emerging diseases. So I will just move on to explain that it's mainly human beings' behaviors, collective behaviors that will drive this. A very interesting subject is that most viruses coming from bats in South America come from plants. So remember what I said earlier, but they can also come from arthropods, and I'm quite surprised actually. There's very few researches on that, and you know that there is some concern on the origins of the Ebola virus, because many bats today in South America come from, well, many viruses in bats come from arthropods or plants, and it's because of their diet that they develop these viruses. So we try then to carry out some interdisciplinary work, but it's very limited, and I'm kind of embarrassed to see that the literature in South America doesn't cross the Atlantic Ocean to provide some guidance on that. That would be very interesting for Africa, for example. So I'm very sorry, but there is no, I don't have much time to talk about that, but there is also the pathogeography. You know that for dengue, for example, we can look at sylvatic cycles, the potential influence of sylvatic cycles, and this work will highlight, well, in green here on the map, the B map, you will see the role of sylvatic cycles from apes in the transmission of the dengue virus. So it's very important to take into consideration the apes' behavior that could actually participate to the transmission of dengue virus. And that is exactly the same thing, but for the yellow fever that actually causes great trouble because the behavior, and so the sylvatic cycle is much more significant than for dengue virus. So what I wanted to say is that scientific output shows traces that archaeologists can highlight. So on this slide, so I can't go into details, but usually works are hindered by some people. That's what happened. Well, I'm doing this work at the WHO, and sometimes it will harm the knowledge of medicine because they will block the emergence of new ideas, and that's what reveals the work we are carrying out. How many people have actually prevented new ideas to come up and to the benefit that could have been beneficial to the planet. And I just wanted to say as well that long-term research is very important, and for us to build knowledge on the 21st and 22nd century, because we can't have knowledge based only on very granular analysis, such as what we do in laboratory, because it's they depend on determinants that happen at the level that you're studying, and you need, when you work in laboratory, you never have the full picture. I recommend to read Ion and Chronos. So it's to understand this approach that I mentioned. It's called Ion et Chronos. I don't know if it has been translated in other languages. But it allows you to understand better the problems with agriculture, and agriculture is essential to understand the emergence of new infectious agents, because agriculture is having an impact on natural ecosystems, and especially in intertropical areas. So it shows that the exposure to microbial agents that have existed for years and years. And an infectious agent doesn't become a pathogen by necessity. It becomes a pathogen in a circumstantial way. I mean, there's only practices and behaviors and the development of a global agriculture that are detrimental to natural ecosystems and that expose individuals to microbial genes that, because of the circumstances, will expose individuals to new microbial genes that then we call infectious, emerging infectious pathogens. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for those who invited me and who supported me in my career, and I am willing to answer your questions. So we have 10 to 15 minutes left, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We have a question here. I will read it to you. So given the complexity of these notions, inter, multi, transdisciplinarity, what is the right scale for intervention? Research unit, research department, institution, state? That's a very interesting question, but there is a problem in terms of culture. I mean, I feel like there's no better research than others, but I feel like some countries are more into interdisciplinarity than we are in France, because for the past 50 years, the Ministry of Research has been asking us to do interdisciplinarity, but without giving us a methodology. And when you look at, well, my presentation, when I explain what is multi-trans interdisciplinarity, it's not by having, well, disciplines working together, and especially if some of them think they are hegemonic, that you will get inter and transdisciplinarity. It's not by forcing people to do that and to address disciplines they're not interested in and they don't need, that you will actually develop interdisciplinarity. However, you need to use people who already have this approach and who are used to do this work. It's more about culture, individuals, skills, than self-proclaimed interdisciplinary work. So rather enough, you know, we talk a lot about this, but we don't act very much. There's too much lip service. And there is what I call geographical confinement, a lockdown, so the impossibility to work with other disciplines. We have an excellency laboratory in Guyana, and there is the role of each and every one of us that are essential drivers to actually get to this interdisciplinarity. So we need to rely on people who have this culture of interdisciplinarity. Thank you. There's another question. The regional, well, Global Health Council will be replaced by One Health Council or advisors. Well, I will not. Well, I'm an expert at WHO on mycobacteriosis, and so the organizations, as it was created for our 5-day program, it goes against One Health concept. It doesn't. it's as if the system itself didn't understand the messages from One Health. It remains very technical. It's more diagnosis based. It focuses on, well, main research, but it doesn't look at the origin of these microbial genes, and hence our embarrassment. And yet the institution over the past few years and in the framework of the pandemic kept talking about One Health. So I'm very uncomfortable here. Because in its acts, in what I perceive, with an important meeting of the WHO over 5 days, we see that there's not this culture of interdisciplinarity.
Merci.
Another question, what do you think of the One Health Institute to train decision makers that is about to be created in France? That's not something I haven't looked up, really. Many people might say that, well, we've done One Health our whole life. It's just like Obelix, you know, the French comics character. It's One Health Institute is what I call hypochoristic research. So it's basically simple words that you create and that are used for children, you know, like pooping, pee, you know, and One Health is like this hypochoristic science. And so that's not something that I have looked at, because we need less One Health institutes and more institutes that actually show what is interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And that's something we absolutely need in Europe and France in particular. So I'm still waiting to see what will happen, and especially as I took part in the program Health and Environment, and that dealt with One Health and talking about zoonosis and also of transmission problems of antibiotic resistance to antibiotics. Up until the fourth program, Health and Environment. And so, but I see that it drifted apart from a broad vision to a more specific approach, like to some specific issues. So I'm curious to see what will happen with this One Health Institute, and especially in this very tense environment. Well, this pressure. There are 4 disciplines basically that claim the right to say that they have created One Health, but One Health is not the first one that was created, as I said. And remember the fascinante study that showed that this 121 programs in sub-Saharan Africa do everything but One Health, really. Thank you. We have 2 additional questions from Ayuba, Dr. Ayuba, who said, thank you for this, your intervention, François. So my understanding is that we should seek Ebola virus reservoirs in other reservoirs than animals. Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, there was a couple who lived in Belgium and in the Max Planck Institute. I don't know, maybe you know them, a couple of researchers who wrote articles, well, I don't remember the name, but they said like we need to look at other reservoirs, saying basically what I just said. No bat eats only fruits or flowers, etc. So that's what we call phenology. So it's, again, the long term, the long run. So depending on the flowering of in Central Africa that hasn't blossomed, like then the bat actually ate sort of a cricket, an arthropod. But I can't speak further of that. Okay, I will ask you another question. Does the One Health concept actually stress the importance of working together in the framework of collaborative approach? Well, yes, in a seminar that I host from the Val de Grace school, a military school in Paris, on emerging infectious diseases over the past 12 years, we've been motivated by creating this interdisciplinarity, and that means absolve the hegemony of some disciplines. So you can't have interdisciplinarity and having transdisciplinarity if some disciplines think, behave as if they were hegemonic and that if they knew everything about everything and didn't listen to other disciplines. And even in anthropology or sociology that I include. And so there are some disciplines, as I said, which behave as if they were hegemonic. And so we need to put an end to that. And the question of emerging infectious diseases are not, about disruption. I mean, of ecological disruption. They're not only about animal and human health. It's because of human intrusion in some ecosystems, and that imbalance, disrupt cycles of viruses, bacteria, parasite fungi that have been here forever and that we disrupt. And human species becomes a target because of their space occupancy, their organization, etc. Okay, one last question about the emerging infectious diseases. Well, thank you very much for all your questions that were very interesting. We need, to be straightforward, I think, and I have many colleagues and associates and I discuss with them, and I think that researchers from IRD in particular have this interdisciplinarity because they have kept this contact, they're kept in contact with people, cultures, and the respect of these cultures. And I believe we need researchers out of their laboratory. Researchers stay too much time in their laboratories and are not enough or sufficiently on the field. And it's the case for many infectiologists in France, in the academic world in particular, because one of the traditions here in France for infectiologists, and I published studies about that, is actually to get trained on tropical fields in NGOs. And I think it's a very good thing because it allows you to work on the field, to have this grassroots actions. And actually, some of our colleagues have preserved this culture, this knowledge, and this respect of the work on the field and the populations, the local populations that you meet. INSERM is much more of a highly technical institute, and that work mostly on in specialized areas. But we need people who are specialized, of course. When you have analyzed a complex phenomenon such as this one, you need to delve deeper into this knowledge, into this issue. And so we need to keep these institutes, of course. So we need to think about how to organize in France and with our partners, and especially with all of these concepts, we need interdisciplinarity. It's not mandatory. We need specialists, as I said. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you, all of you, to have participated and attended this webinar, and thank you for your questions, and see you soon. Yes, if you want me to share some of the publications I mentioned, it would be my honor. Yes, it would be great, and you can give us the link, and we'll share it with everyone so that everyone can have access. Yeah, and feel free to ask any questions by email. Feel free to reach out. Okay, thank you very much. Bye. See you soon.